Everliving. I went missing in the autumn of '07. I was 15 at the time, not yet old enough to drive, but more than old enough to get myself into trouble. I was gone for a week, and when I was finally plucked off the roadside of the Parksville Crosspike, the authorities in Boyle County tried their best to pry details out of me about where I'd been. My parents did too, after the initial rapture of my discovery faded away. But I quickly learned not to tell anybody much of anything about the time I spent away from home. I remembered perfectly well, but whenever I started to test the waters, first with the police and then with my family, they reacted as if I were leading them on. Despite my youth, I was well aware that spinning strange and fantastic yarns about how I'd made it on my own during that week spent in the chill air of November might make the inquirers assume I was schizophrenic, or otherwise masking some trauma with the cliché of false memory. For my own peace of mind, as well as theirs, I told them I'd merely gotten lost after slipping out for a night walk, that I had wandered the countryside, cutting across pastures and sleeping in the woods. Though they never fully believed that, I carried on the charade long enough that the questions stopped coming, and I was left to brood over my experiences alone. And brood is precisely what I've done. I hadn't just wandered fields and forests and backyards for 7 nights alone, you see. Not at all. It had started as something like that, but had fast become something else entirely. The night it began, I snuck out around midnight, as I often did. Usually I would wander the country roads I lived along purely for the open air and sky, as I was restless and prone to nights spent laying awake even in my youth. But some nights, like that night, I had an aim. It was a Saturday, and I meant to walk the 6 miles or so out to a friend's house, talk and smoke for an hour or so, and then hike back before dawn, hopefully undiscovered. That friend, Austin, had been banned from spending time with me back during the summer, when we'd landed ourselves in trouble for some ill-advised vandalism, and it had become a weekend tradition for us both to slip out and meet in the ruins of an old farmhouse in the pasture across the road from his place to catch up. Truth be told, though Austin and I were thick as thieves, we did this just as much to spite the restriction as we did to talk. The walk out was business as usual. The moon was nearly full, as I recall it, and the sparse, rural landscape threw no obscuring light upon the stars. They glimmered overhead just as the gleam of an early frost glinted on the limbs and leaves of the forests around me. The chill air made the long walk easier, and the windless night was almost void of noise. It was a bit too cold for bug or frog song, and other than the occasional owl, or a cow stirring in its pasturage at my passing, I seemed to be alone on the winding roads. No car passed me, and the houses along the road sat silent as stones in the pale light of night, as was always the case at this hour. It was a peaceful trek, and even if my youthful self could never have put into words why I loved the hours after sundown out here so deeply, I look back on long, quiet walks like those now with something close to reverence. The only tense part of that particular night's walk was a dark and overcast patch of trees along a creek bank that hugged the roadside as I turned onto Austin's road. What moonlight there was fast swallowed by the fading leaves of the swollen oaks and elms, the gravel became a ghostly outline in the murk, and the babble of water over ancient stone echoed beneath the tree tunnel canopy. but the tension I felt during that brief 80 or 90 yards of deaf darkness was entirely normal. For whatever reason, my mind dropped unheard and unglimpsed lurkers or pursuers in the shadows there, and though no harm had ever befallen me on this stretch of road, I didn't truly relax until I'd escaped from beneath the boughs. I quickened my pace and hummed aloud, as if the sound of human tones might banish the gurgling of the stream and the crunching of gravel, or scare off some unseen presence in the bleak and black. I only slowed when the moonlight of a blessedly open sky found me again, and my friend's home was in sight. The small house sat upon a sprawling, open hill, with only a few venerable old trees to watch over it. It was dark, but then again, it usually was. Austin's family turned in early. But I didn't see the black shape of a figure on the porch, waiting to come down and meet me. I assumed he might have accidentally fallen asleep, as he'd done before, and hadn't yet risen from bed. I began to climb the driveway, meaning to tap at his window and rouse him, but was stopped cold halfway up when I first registered that there were no cars in the drive. Austin's father drove a school bus for the county, which sat up against the house as ever. But both his mother's truck and his father's rickety Jeep were missing. I was a bit less careful then. I pressed the rest of the way up, and made certain the cars weren't parked up behind the house, and then rounded the building to tap at Austin's window as planned. But no answer came, and when I dared to shine the flashlight I'd brought to navigate the ruined farmhouse through the window and light up the room, I found it empty, bed made, and door closed. I flicked off the light and went around to the porch. I hesitated at the front door. My assumption was that Austin's parents had gone away, perhaps to deal with some family business, and I figured Austin himself would have sent me a message if he couldn't talk that night. He'd been emailing me, so his parents wouldn't catch him texting me on the flip phone, but there had been no message, and I thought he must still be here. But when at last I convinced myself to knock, and eventually knock again, there came no answer. The night seemed painfully quiet all of a sudden. I waited another 5 minutes or so there on the porch, fidgeting and watching the lights of distant houses over wooded hills flicker in the haze of cold hill country air. When, eventually, I accepted the fact that the house was empty, I turned and trudged back down the driveway. Perhaps, I thought, he was already at the farmhouse. The lonely road awaited, with the placid creek still gurgling on the far side. I stepped over a path of large stones we'd piled for crossings, bumbled through a scraggly patch of woods, and emerged onto the pasture beyond. It hadn't been used in some decades, and we had cut away the barbed wire barrier in childhood. The farmhouse that once oversaw the fields now stood amidst chest-high grass, and the skeletons of scattered saplings creeping up to one day reclaim the space for the woodland. The paint had all but flaked away, and the roof had caved in near the back of the structure. The leaning porch still stood, the place which hosted our ritual weekend smokes and talks. But again I faced a vacant porch. The field was wholly isolated by surrounding trees and hills, thin as the fall had made them, and I risked flicking on the flashlight and throwing the powerful beam in through the hanging front door. I raised my voice to shout, but managed only half the holler I'd meant to give, calling Austin's name. I only registered how nervous I was then, when my meek call faded off into the still, windless evening, and silence returned to the blue-tinged moonlit field. It was the first time I'd ever been here alone after dark, but nervousness about the tottering old house wasn't the reason for my unease. I knew Austin was not in there, and though I had no way of knowing at the time, I somehow knew something bad had happened. My first impulse was to find out what, but there wasn't much to be done then and there. My mind was a jumble trying to sort out what might be happening, but the most likely theory I could posit was that some sort of family emergency or strange circumstance had arisen, and Austin had left with his parents in a rush. I figured I should go home, wait up until morning, and then try and have some other friend call him, or even his parents, to get some idea of what had gone wrong. I retraced my steps across the creek bed and began the long walk back home, the night's quiet calm suddenly made stifling by the unease that had crept into me. I think I knew then on some fundamental, instinctual level that something was dreadfully wrong, and my lack of certainty only made my thoughts swirl faster. So consumed was I by this tumult of possibilities and plans that I didn't take note of the tree tunnel until I was already shrouded in its dense shadow. I paid it no heed. For once, consumed by a fear I found more real, I was free from childish worry about the lack of light and the ear-drowning rumble of the stream off the roadside. I've come to believe that worry over the dark tunnel of branches above Austin's road wasn't just a childish night fear, that it was always a hint of something real. That there was something about that little span of uncomfortable, overgrown space which made what was about to happen possible, and that, subconsciously, I had felt the danger of just such an unthinkable possibility during my prior walks through those foreboding shadows. Austin had spoken of it too, had told me how, years earlier, our friend Patrick had refused to make his short 5-minute walk home after an early nightfall in winter made the road black. He had needed to be driven home. Patrick had said then that there were lights in the trees down there, and that he did not like them. Austin himself had agreed in later days that there had been lights, but on the couple occasions I pressed him on how eerie the tree tunnel was when we were alone, he had always claimed he had only said what he had about the lights to antagonize Patrick, a touch of fraternal cruelty between boys. Still, he had an unease talking about it, and I couldn't help but register he'd never made the trek out to my place after dark without me accompanying him. Perhaps we all knew it was strange, even if none of us, including Patrick after his initial embarrassments, would ever openly acknowledge it for fear of being mocked. Despite that knowledge, as I've said, I was too wound up in worries about Austin to pay real attention to the living tunnel through which I walked. It only really returned to the forefront of my mind when several minutes had passed, and I'd not yet exited the gloom the tunnel of trees cast over the winding gravel road. I'd been in a sort of thoughtful trance, my eyes on the crunching pallid stones beneath my feet. But when my eyes rose, I saw no moonlit extension of the path ahead of me, where the trees broke and the wholesome expanse of sky returned. A dread came upon me as I looked about, for I realized I couldn't see much of anything, that all but the faintest ambient light from overhead had been swallowed up, and no yellow gleam of distant porch lights broke the branches and scrub to either side of me. I heard no babble of water in the creek, and as I stood there doubting myself in the dark, I heard no owl or distant engines navigating more active roads to drag me from my dread. It was, in that first moment of realization, all quiet. A rumble sounded, low and long, thunder rippling earthward from some point above and away. A storm, I thought. Odd on such a clear night, but perhaps it's blown in fast and fierce. I pressed on a minute or so, walking near blind, too nervous to turn on my light in the quiet dark, and barely able to trace the faint outline of the brighter gravel. Eventually, as the drip of a nascent rain began to trickle down from the branches overhead and wet my hair, I lost the path altogether. Despite my nerves, I flicked on the light I carried after a moment's frenzied breathing and thinking, and what I saw was that grass and weeds had overtaken the road. So thick were they that I could barely trace its edges even in the stark light of the beam. I panicked, but simultaneously tried to calm myself with explanations I muttered aloud under my breath like mantras against evil forces. Anything to break the silence. I'd just wound off down some ATV trail or old driveway, I thought. So wound up in my thoughts I hadn't realized where I was headed. But after turning around and retracing my path back up the gravel for an agonizing 5 or 6 minutes, I'd not only not found a familiar stretch of open gravel, but had entirely lost sight or feel of any gravel beneath the matted rug of twisted grass and weed. I turned homeward again, confused and not thinking clearly in the flood of panic, and broke into a run. I counted as I did, trying to keep time in my head. 60 seconds approached 300, and by the end of the 5th shoddily counted minute at a breathless sprint, I tripped over a gnarled branch upon the ground, and sprawled to the sodden undergrowth as a desperate and damp mess. The rain was roaring down through the treetops by then, but the air had grown warm with its coming, unnaturally so, though I wouldn't really register the extent of the strangeness of the temperature until later. As it was, I scrambled to my feet and threw the beam of my light around in desperation, half expecting a pursuer to be framed by the trees behind me, but none stood there. My light found only the massive and gnarled trunks of ancient trees, far larger than any that grew along Austin's road, and a tangle of impossible saplings, briars, and vines that blocked the avenue of grassy path along which I'd been running just seconds earlier. It was as if the forest itself was closing in about me. It wasn't the forest I'd walked through earlier in the night, though. Of that much I'd soon become certain. The trees were far larger and older, with hoary bark thick as armor and roots that wound like still serpents through the choking underbrush. The leaves overhead were far too dense for November, and the darkness had become absolute past the cruel cold beam of the light I carried. Having dropped it in the stumble, I had to flounder for it in the grass and nettles for a desperate moment. The panic that took hold as the blackness took me was total, only abating when my hand closed around the flashlight once more. The noise of the stream was still gone, perhaps swallowed by the rain, I thought, but other sounds had come into the fore. The chittering of animals and the scuttling progress of low-set beasts through the underbrush was constant. The chirp and song of insects which buzzed past in the gloom joined that chorus. Solitary, distant lights flared and died, but they were often overhead or far distant through intervening greenery. They gleamed a bluish green that did not sit naturally in the landscape. Indeed, the landscape itself was unnatural, with everything from the sudden warmth to the verdant canopy to the gigantic trees that disappeared into the maze of obscuring branches overhead, conspiring to leave an impression of almost sorcerous unease. I did not belong here, or this place. These trees and ghost lights and sounds did not belong here. Whichever was the case, I was surrounded by unfamiliar things down to the strange and bloated blades of grass and black, clinging moss that clogged the ground. The smell of long rotten wood and upturned earth mingled with the damp scent of rain and storms, and carried my imagination to dark things. I was not alone underneath the trees. The snapping of branches and the rustle of greenery told me as much, and in the spaces between the ancient trunks I imagined things which may or may not have been there, leaning silhouettes and half-glimpsed reflections in the dark. I glimpsed a bony, horned head dark amidst the trees overhead, and on seeing the vague glint of its many eyes in the beam I fled, though, whatever it was, it gave no pursuit that I heard. I kept running, only just cautious enough to keep from sprawling down amidst the roots and weeds again. I didn't have the presence of mind to know where I was going, or what I thought I'd find. I didn't wonder what had happened beyond registering that it was not natural, and I was not safe. I just wanted to get out, and I did my best to hug the slight lull in the jungle-thick tangle which I believed marked the place where Austin's gravel road had once cut the trees. But I climbed and shimmied as often as I ran, for the roots and fallen trees which clogged the path were often taller than I was, and the spaces between them were clogged with pooled water, jagged old stone, and unblinking, shimmering eyes. The bluish-green luminescence I'd glimpsed revealed itself to be bloated lightning bugs with stingers on them, often large as my head, which sometimes swirled in glowing clouds hundreds of feet overhead amongst unseen treetops, and sometimes lazed sluggishly on the lower branches, shimmering in and out of the shadow as their lights waxed and waned. The ground shook now and then as great limbs shifted tightened trees and thudded down into wet earth, only ever glimpsed as shadows and sensations from where I clambered on the ground far below. Outlines made hazy by my flight in the confusing blackness lunged at me from the dark, but never pursued for long, spoiled for prey in the teeming wilderness into which I'd stumbled. I spooked a wiry fawn with glowing nodes along its spine and far too many limbs, which had been grazing in the undergrowth as I navigated a mossy chasm between two fallen trunks, and as that impossible, alien fawn scuttled spider-like up the trunk of a neighboring tree, a thin pincer larger than a grown man snapped out from a crook in the roots, and dragged it screeching into the dark, all painted in the cruel, cold light of my flashlight's beam. Such screams sounded in the shadows as often as did chirps and bird calls as the eternal orgy of birth and death played itself out unseen in the murky bowels of the ancient, unplumbed wood. Overhead, the deafening peal of thunder would occasionally ring out like church bells tolling the hour, and drive the beasts and shifting plants of the ancient groves and warrens into momentary silence, as if all were afraid to disrupt the roar of the storm, lest they draw attention to themselves. I can't tell you how long I traveled. Time moved strangely in that world beneath the trees. I only know that it felt like hours, and my legs ached by the time I stumbled out onto a more open span of ground. I found that it was broken asphalt, a road so eaten through by roots and tufts of unwholesome and shuffling grass that it served more as a suggestion than a route, but a road nonetheless. The trees still ate the sky overhead, but their moon-strangling canopy was over 100 feet up, and the 20 or so foot gap in the growth to either side brought me a small tinge of relief. Any lunging hunter from the woodland would have to cross 10 or more feet of open ground to snatch me from the avenue. While that was a small and ultimately false comfort looking back at it now, it made all the difference at the time, with memories of scuttling arachnids and slithering serpents in the maze of roots I'd left behind fresh in my mind. I walked up the way a while, emboldened by the relatively open air and the presence of some trace of human influence in all this alien greenery and murk. I had turned right onto the broken road and was moving along in that direction, praying that what I had found was the Parksville crosspike I'd turned off to get onto Austin's road in the first place. I don't know what I believed was happening then. I don't even know now. But I suppose in the stress and the chaos of the moment, I hoped whatever was happening still had some root in the world that was, and that I'd be able to find my way out if I just kept going towards home. I was further emboldened when I came upon a bridge a short way down the road. The very same creek that Austin's road followed cut beneath the crosspike not far from the point where the roads met. and I wanted desperately to believe this was that creek, and the bridge I'd come to meant I was on the right path. But two glaring differences reared up to puncture any certainty I might have had right away. The first was that the bridge, rather than being one of concrete, was an old and rickety thing of stone. So cloaked in black, damp lichen and twitching, softly glowing fungi was the path over the center, that I slipped and slid as much as stepped across it, all while vile frogs with many mouths sang in fetid pools amidst breaks in the stone. The second was the creek which was supposed to run beneath it, for beneath the aging bridge there was no creek. Rather, a chasm 10 or so feet wide fell away into blackness beneath, with 1,000 and more runoff streams of rainfall draining from the surrounding woods to fall into the fog of damp darkness in the bowels of the pit. Thunder sounded, but this time, from my perch on the bridge above the chasm, I registered that the sound came up from below, only to echo off the dense living roof of leaves and swarming insects far overhead. It shook the bridge and sent me scuttling for the far side. Much as the chasm and the bridge shook my certainty that I'd found familiar landmarks within this teeming mire of rotten life, I didn't have many options. Uncertain as I now was, I started a brisk walk further on up the road. But the silence which had followed the thunder lingered here, and I tried to keep my noise to a minimum. I almost flicked off the light after half a minute passed in solemn quiet save the rain drumming down from the leaves far above, but fear of the near blackness of the nighttime forest closing in about me prevented me from doing so. Still, I felt watched, and I spent much time glancing around at the surrounding trees. I was watched, by many things, rather than one imagined hunter, but the eye-shine I so often spotted lurking in the branches and brambles off the overgrown roadside never pursued. Ape things with too many arms and jagged smiles perched and dangled from tree limbs, and hanging, saucer-eyed stalkers wrapped in bat wings stirred now and again amidst the swarms of insects far above. Heads with clacking mandibles ducked behind trunks to escape my beam, and cruel-jawed crickets large enough to hunt a man leapt into startling motion to clear the path as I came upon their crooks in the roots that chewed the broken road. None came for me. Rather, they watched, wide-eyed. Perhaps they understood as well as I did that I was not meant to be seeing what I was seeing. Or perhaps they were not so much watching me, but waiting for what was to come. Whatever the case, minutes ticked by, and just as I was making to climb the hill in the road that would take me out of sight from the bridge I'd crossed, a roaring rumble of thunder sounded again, this one truly deafening, and issuing again from the chasm which ate the rain. I turned. There was something clambering up back there from the gap and hauling itself onto the ground beside the bridge. Something gigantic. When it stood, its heights scraped and shuffled the canopy of the impossibly towering trees about me. Its limbs were oblong and gnarled with the grubby texture of old and rotting wood. Its outline was vaguely human, but large as a towering building, and formed from breathing and rippling bark and branch. Its head was a cluster of thorns and boughs that gave it the silhouette of a stag. The beam of my light climbed it, and though the distance and the mist of the damp forest air prevented a clear view, I could tell its eyes, or something gleaming and glinting in the dark overhead at least, were cast down upon me. It took a groaning step forward, its Titan gait carrying it countless yards in a single, casual bound, and the noise of its root-riven foot thumping the broken pavement, shuddering through the forest like the death knell of a fallen tree. I ran again, but though I ran, I knew there was no escaping it. Not by running along the road. It had seen me, seen my light, and now, in pursuit, it did not even have to chase. It merely plodded, and with every thumping stride, the thunder of its tread grew nearer, and my certainty that I'd be crushed or devoured or destroyed grew deeper. The forest to either side of my sprint was a cacophony of movement and chaos, as 1,000 sprawling beasts and scuttling scavengers fled for the deepest reaches of the wood, in fear of this minder of the trees. As I crested the hill and tucked out of view of the straightaway I'd been on for a moment, the giant gaining all the while, a voice rang out from the woods off to my left, familiar amidst the forest of foreign scents and sights and sounds. And yet its presence there amidst so many strange sensations and experiences made it the strangest of them all. It was, unmistakably, Austin's voice, and he called my name several times, urging me to come into the trees. I did so. I almost turned back several times, but the thunderous advance of the giant thing drove me into the tangle of root and leaf and branch as readily as Austin's distant voice beckoned me deeper into the manse. As the noise of pursuit died slowly away behind me, and the calls of my friend grew louder and louder, I came upon a clearing centered on a great tree stump, darkened with the wood rot of great age, and home to vast garden clusters of phosphorescent fungi. It was larger than any fortress ever raised by men, and its heights teemed with the soldiers of towering termite mounds of mud and refuse that had grown fat upon its decay. There was a hollow in its side, vast and cavern-like, and from this black aperture, Austin's voice issued once more, calling on me to come down into the hollow. I hesitated. I had seen more than a few terrible predators slink forth from such holes and hollows and caves in the forest floor during my initial run through the tangle. But the voice assured me it was safe, and as the thunder sounded on the roadway not too far behind me once more, I could not help but imagine my giant pursuer kneeling down and looking for spoor like some vast hunter, preparing to trail me into the bleak depths of its forest domain. So I listened and descended, overwhelmed for a few moments by the hanging moisture on the air and the choking taste of entropy about me, before my eyes and lungs adjusted, and the chamber in which I now stood came into focus. The vast den beneath the stump was walled with the moldering roots of the long-dead tree, and the squirming larvae of the giant termites that called the rotten husk home. The ceiling, a great mass of tree tendrils and wet corded fungus hanging like matted hair from the roof, was shimmering with the jostling forms of bats. The floor was soft with their refuse, and it mixed with the slurry of rain runoff to create a slick and treacherous swamp, which had to be navigated with care. The voice came again, and I realized all at once what it issued from. At the center of the rotting den was a massive stone, greenish with age in the stark light of the beam, and strange of shape, with edges and outcrops that made it look almost like a gigantic man curled up in anguish upon the ground. Down the rough dome of its lichen-matted head ran a crude and jagged crack, and though it did not budge, it was from within this strip of darkness that the disembodied voice of Austin flowed. It told me that I was safe here, and that I could rest with it a while, that the giant on the road would not find us here. It told me it had been calling for some time, and that it was fortunate I had come within earshot of it, that it had expected I might come, but that there had been no guarantees I would stumble upon its abode in the wood Everliving. I told it I recognized its voice. It agreed that I had, a sort of humorless affirmation that seemed almost mechanical. I asked if it was Austin hiding in the rock, if he had somehow gotten lost in this alien place just like I had. It told me it supposed it was Austin, in a way, but it denied it had ever been lost. It had always been here, it said, and belonged nowhere else. The voice that spoke in Austin's cadence and tone told me the wood Everliving, it used that name again then, was beyond the veil of my earth, but that this wood Everliving simultaneously represented a perfectly wild and perfectly barbarous incarnation of it. It said wild and sweeping things about man's animal nature and the quiet, servile sadness of the waking earth that haunt me with a creeping depression to this day, about the futility of the life I had ahead of me back home. But then its musings grew more adolescent and more familiar. It said personal things, things only Austin would know, about the trouble we'd gotten into and the reasons we'd engaged in it. Like addicts to the sensation of thrill, it had said. It reminisced in the first person, recalling how we'd cut the tires and damaged the homes of officious school personnel. It said we might have gone unnoticed if we had not found the risk so thrilling, and that the reason the risk was its own reward was precisely because life beyond risk had little meaning. Austin's voice then said he was new here, seemingly contradicting what he'd said earlier, but simultaneously showing none of the uncertainty and shallowness of confusion. He said he had not yet found his legs in the wood Everliving. He told me it had been his time to find real risks to take, to cease surviving, and begin living anew. He then assured me a day would come when I would cease and begin anew too, that I would join him. But it was not meant to be today. He directed me to leave the den when I was ready, and make my way back to the shattered road. He instructed me to walk with my eyes closed down the route, and to only open them to ensure my direction had been maintained every so often. When you see the moon, he said, you will know you are back where you belong. As if in a dream, I didn't ask for elaboration, or press any of the questions I've held onto in the years since. I just did as he asked, and wound my way back out of the forest tangle onto the asphalt, where I shuffled blind for perhaps an hour along my weary way. I would glimpse upward now and again, and listen out for the return of a giant which never returned. But otherwise, I left my light off, and navigated by feel along the rough ground. And when at last the air became chill and the sweat of jungle humidity died away and the omnipresent tumult of water and animal chatter fell slowly silent, I opened my eyes to see that the moon had risen in a crystal clear sky overhead, and that the trees along the pastured roads were not towering, impossible monoliths with trunks wide as houses. But the patrol car that picked me up during a brief sweep of the road and the questions that followed thereafter told me a week had passed, and it drove home my belief that time was strange and erratic wherever I'd been, like light deflected or manipulated against a mirror. No more than a long night had passed for me, and yet my parents had been searching frantically for me for 7 long days. As it turned out, Austin had been killed in a car accident the evening before my Saturday walk out to see him, and his father badly injured. My parents had assumed I'd found out and had done something to myself, and the authorities had assumed much the same, but they said I was strangely unaffected by the news. When the questions about where I had been and why I had gone finally stopped, and the mundane crawl of life began again, I definitely missed long talks with him when the nights drew on, but I knew he was where he was meant to be. As the years grew longer and I tried more avidly to escape the most mundane of life's obligations and miseries, I dreamed more and more of that wood Everliving. Now, as I write this, I dream of it nightly. I run through it nightly. I feel the call to visit the collapsing old farmhouse along Austin's gravel road, where his family home stands empty, and the trees still grow thick along the creek banks. I have been told in sleep that something waits for me there, a guide to worlds wilder than my own, where we will bound in the frenzied ecstasy of uncertainty forever.